All right, Acts 27. As we jump into this chapter, we are 2 chapters away from the conclusion of the book of Acts. It's this fascinating story of the early church. The first half of the book of Acts tells us about a man, mostly it focuses on Peter, but it's focusing on the Jerusalem church more broadly. As we come into about chapter 9, a man named Paul is introduced to us, and we see his conversion story. Paul had been a follower of Judaism. He had followed the Old Testament laws to the letter. And then in chapter 9, Jesus reveals himself to him miraculously. And so we find Paul's life just being turned upside down. And when I say upside down, what I actually mean is Paul's life was upside down and it got turned right side up. And so Paul is pursuing Jesus. He is growing in his faith. And then he goes out and begins these missionary journeys throughout the region. And so he's going from what would be modern day Israel and some modern day Turkey, jumps over into Macedonia and Greece, and then makes his way back to Jerusalem. But all through this time, Paul is convinced that he needs to go to Rome to testify of Jesus. Now, Rome is the capital of the empire that all of this is unfolding in. Paul is a citizen of Rome, and so Paul is able to go to this city, and yet God just has not opened doors. He has closed them and closed them and closed them until finally here, God opens up a door in a really unexpected way. He opens up the door as Paul is arrested. And as Paul is arrested in Jerusalem, he goes through a series of trials and then finds himself appealing to Caesar in one of the final trials that we talked about last week, standing before a man named Festus. And as he appeals to Caesar, now he is being placed on a boat and going to Rome. And that's what we're going to look at today, is we're going to look at this specific part of the journey. But as Paul, what we're going to see, Paul today will not arrive in Rome. In fact, today Paul will be shipwrecked. All right? Paul will be shipwrecked today. And so this is not going as Paul had planned. You follow me? No one plans on a few things. My wife and I, we have twins. No one plans on twins. No one plans on shipwrecks. And so this is what's happening and unfolding here in the story. And as we get into it, this is one of the things that actually makes this story kind of unique, not just among the Bible, but really among ancient literature. This is actually, believe it or not, one of the most detailed descriptions of a shipwreck from the era it was written in. This is one of the most teased out stories coming from the ancient Mediterranean. And so we're going to dig into this story. And as we do, we're going to see Paul on his way to Rome, and we're going to see some principles and some things that just jump out to us that we ought to be reminded of throughout this story. And so let's begin in verse number 1. What we find is when it was decided that we should sail for Italy here you could just substitute Rome. They delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which is about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day, we put in at Sidon. And this would be modern day. Sidon here is coming up the coast of modern-day Israel and so what would be modern-day Lebanon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. And so far, what we've been watching is we've been watching Paul just kind of traveling up the coast here, making some short stops. When we come to verse number 6, the centurion found a ship of Alexandria. And so this is coming from Alexandria in Egypt, sailing for Italy, and put us on board. And so what we're finding here in verse number 6 is this is a merchant ship. This is a merchant ship. This little cohort of soldiers transporting these prisoners, they don't have their own formal transportation. They just have a job to do. Get the prisoners from here to there. However you need to do it, here's some money, be on your way. And so they decide that it'll be quicker, in fact, it'll be much quicker to travel by sea. And so they find the ship of Alexandria. It's a merchant ship, and we actually see later in the chapter they're carrying grain coming from Alexandria, one of the largest producers on the Nile River Delta, coming up to Rome. And so this ship, just to have some understanding of the ship that we're looking at, this ship would have been a merchant vessel with a single mast. This is pretty well documented what all of these ships would have looked like in this era. Single mast ship, no true rudder in the sense of what we think of as a modern day rudder, but this would have had two oars coming out of the back of the ship that were kind of used for steering. So think about if you're kayaking and you kind of put the oar into the side of the boat, a little bit like that, just a lot bigger scale, and so a lot more unwieldy as all this is going on. These ships were not able to drive against the wind. In fact, they were just kind of moseying their way to Italy. Normally, under ideal conditions, it's believed that this ship could have gone from Alexandria to Rome in about a month's time. But we're going to find that this is significantly far from ideal conditions. And so they pay for the passage to Rome. And as they do so, in verse number 7, in fact, we read, "We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone, coasting along it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, 'Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives.' But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix." And don't we all want to reach Phoenix in the winter? Different Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And so as much time has already taken place in this journey, they're not moving quickly. The Bible tells us that the fast was over. This fast would be referring to the Jewish holiday that today we would call Yom Kippur. This is the Day of Atonement. This is the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. And so this gives us an idea of what time of year it is. If you want some perspective, this year's Yom Kippur fell on October 12th. And so this is not much earlier in the season than we are now. The winds are beginning to change. The climate is beginning to cool off. Winter is coming. And Paul says the journey will be dangerous. But the centurion, the pilot of the ship, the owner, they disagree. They want to keep moving. And so they aim for this city of Phoenix. But what happens as they set out here? Paul counsels them not to, but in verse number 13, "When the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained the purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat." This is the dinghy, if you will, is hanging off the side of the boat. "After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship, to try to strengthen the hull of the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned." And so what just happened here? A really quick shift in the attitude of the travelers. You see, they set sail initially because there was the south wind that was blowing. Everything seemed to be going the way that they wanted to. And so they set out, even with Paul's advisement, to say, hey, this is not a good idea. When all of a sudden, this storm called the Northeaster, or in Greek, Euroclydon, and may have that literally pasted into your translation of the scripture, it strikes this ship. And sometimes, well, can we just back up a minute? Storms happen, don't they? Storms happen. In fact, often in life, storms serve as this metaphor for what we are walking through, these times in our lives that are a little bit choppy. They're a little bit rough, and sometimes a little bit is just vastly underselling it. Sometimes they look a lot like the storms that Paul and his crew are going through right now. And there are some times in life that storms are unavoidable. Sometimes we drift into a storm of our own doing, and in fact, that's what we see playing out here. And as they go into this storm, we can think that we won't be affected by it, and that's what these men thought as they set sail, didn't they? They said, oh, the winds are good. They're at our backs. This is favorable. That's the direction we want to go anyways. Let's take the journey. But then all of a sudden, once they get out into the sea, the winds pick up. And they begin to try to secure the ship. They even take some of the cargo and begin to unload it, trying to take and raise the ship out of the waters just a little bit. And then after days of this storm, what does the Bible tell us in verse 20? Neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. And there's a couple things I want you to understand when the Bible says this. First of all, a storm that the sky, the sun, and the stars are blocked by for days, that's an impressive storm, isn't it? Or as in Michigan, we call it February. For days, they're unable to see the stars and the sun. And you say, wow, that's an impressive storm. And it is. But also catch this with me. How did ships navigate in this era of just maritime travel? They needed the stars. This is hundreds of years before what we would call a modern-day compass is invented that points us to north. They have no idea which direction they are facing. Can you imagine how disorienting that would be? For days on end, you're on a ship, and we're going to see soon that there were over 200 people on this ship, so it's a pretty large ship, which also means that the storm is big enough that they feel like they have to remove cargo so that they can just stay above the waterline because the waves are doing so much to rock this ship. And then for days, there's no chance of navigation, which means as the waves are coming and turning and tossing, you're being spun around, and now you don't even know which way is up. Like if you wanted to escape from this thing, you cannot. And they did, and they could not. The rudders that they had, these oars that were sticking out from the back of the boat, useless. They had pulled them in, they had secured them already. The sails that they had attached to their mast, it wasn't going to help them except make the situation worse. It had been pulled up. They're adrift in the middle of this storm. But isn't that what storms do to us in life? Don't they come in and they show us, they feel dangerous to us in the moment, and oftentimes they are. We feel our sense of safety threatened, and it sends us into a panic. It creates anxiety within us. We become fearful. We become afraid. Oftentimes these storms, they are destructive. Often we find ourselves feeling helpless because there are these things that we desire, these things that we value and that we hang on to, and the storm of life pulls them away from us. Whether it be our health, whether it be a relationship, an opportunity, a job, whatever it may be, we come into it and we say, God, wait a second, that was a valuable thing, and yet this storm all of a sudden interferes and separates us from the thing that we held valuable. But also storms of life, they disorient us, don't they? In those moments that all of a sudden we find ourselves feeling unsafe and we find ourselves mourning the loss of, we lose track of which way is up. It can be easy for us to lose our bearings in the middle of it because we have just been rocked and we have been taken apart. And now we say, okay, God, I know you're somewhere, but I don't even know which way I'm going to pursue you. We have these moments that storms in life, they can put us in situations where we are beyond uncomfortable. Sometimes even we feel hopeless. And that's where this crew had arrived in the storm. They were hopeless. They said, we've tried everything. It's not like we tried nothing and we're out of ideas. We tried everything. And we don't know what to do next. And so they're afraid. They're anxious. They don't understand. But can I share with you today, just like the storm that they encountered was big, the storms of life are big. The storms of life are big. And you've walked through them. You've seen them. And what's incredible is no two storms are alike. Your storms don't look like the storms of the person sitting around you. You may share some of them, but even the way that you go through them is different. But the storms of life can be big. And in fact, the storms are surely much larger than we are. And it helps us to just admit that fact from the beginning. The storms of life are big. But watch what happens as we continue in verse number 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, remember, they were not planning on a long journey here. It had taken a lot longer to get to port. It seems like this port that they were at did not have supplies because they say it wasn't suitable for the winter. And so many believe that that's part of the reason for that. And so they haven't had food for days, which is going to continue to encourage the fear. Paul then, he stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail." So what does Paul do? He says, "I told you so." And some of you guys are just like, man, I don't know if I would have wanted to be around Paul. Man, you know what, Paul? Can you just, where were you staying? The bottom of the ship, just go back there. Overboard? Remember Jonah? Let's just do the Jonah thing, see if it works, just in case. I mean, like if I'm the centurion here, I'm just like, hey, Paul, I know this story. Let's see if it happens again. But I don't think Paul's trying to be arrogant as he says this. I really don't. I think what Paul's trying to do is say, listen, guys, I have some information, and you would be really well served to listen. Because watch what Paul says. He doesn't just stop there. He doesn't just say, I told you so, and the story moves on. He says, you should have listened and not sailed from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. And so Paul here, as he comes in, what does Paul tell these men? Paul comes in, he says, I told you so, but that's not the point. That's not what he's trying to get at and drive home with them. In fact, what he's giving to them is a message of hope. He says, listen, none of you will be harmed. God has revealed to me, God has shown me this, he has spoken to me. And what we find is this is the last time in the book of Acts that we see specifically that God is revealing himself to Paul in these really unique ways. And every time it happens in such a way as to reveal, God reveals himself or his plan or his will when Paul needs him the most, doesn't he? In those moments where Paul doesn't have direction. If you think back, Paul is on his way to Damascus in chapter 9. Jesus interrupts him. You fast forward just a little bit and you find that Paul is going, God, I know you have me to go to a different place, but I'm not sure which place. So I think I'm going to go here. God, if this is where you would have me. And then God sends a vision of a man from Macedonia getting up and saying, hey, come here and help us. And so he sets out, and we find the establishment of the churches in Corinth and the church in Philippi and Thessalonica up here in Macedonia in Greece. And then we find a little bit later, Paul has now been arrested, and there's a plot to kill him that's coming down the pike. There are those who are scheming against him. And God comes and shows himself and says, Paul, listen, they aren't going to touch you because I still have business with you in Rome. And then now here, when Paul doesn't know which way is up, almost literally, he says, listen, he sends his angel. He says, no, you're going to be safe. I'm going to continue to take care of you. And not only that, but I'll care for everyone in the ship. The ship itself will be lost, but everyone who's in it, they're going to make it to the shore. And so Paul shares this news, and they are encouraged. Life is coming into them. You see, God had a plan still for Paul and for these individuals. And can I share with you, this news was encouraging for them, and it ought to be. Because while the storms of life are big, can we just say God is great? And in fact, God is greater than our storms. He's bigger than these problems that we face. He's bigger than Godzilla or the monsters on TV, to quote the great theologian Junior Asparagus. Okay? You see, the problems that we have pale in comparison to the God of the universe, the one who created the waters, scooped out the seas that now they are tossed and turned in, the one who planted the seeds for those trees to grow that the ship would be made from, the one who told the winds to blow, and the one who could stand up and tell the winds to cease. Greater than the storms. And so can I encourage you this morning? Yes, storms will come. Yes, in the moment you say, I don't know which way I'm turning. It feels like I can't even hear God speak. But so often God does his best work in the middle of the storm. Because God helps us to understand that in the middle of the storm, the thing that we think is so big and so powerful and so all-encompassing, God just kind of like pulls back the curtain a little bit and says, you think that's impressive? Watch this. Because God's bigger than those storms. I've stood in awe before some of the great wonders of nature. The California redwoods are one of my favorite things that I've just ever seen with my eyes. These trees are just incredible. You stand at the base of them, and you just look up, and you're like, it stops somewhere up there. It doesn't even make sense. Some of these trees, if you drive through the area, some of them have fallen over the years, and you just see this like hulk of a chunk of wood in the middle of the forest. You see the roots, and you go up to the roots, and you're just like, this thing is towering. On its side, it's one of the largest trees I've ever seen. And it's incredible, these giant sequoias in the area that are just these massive wonders of God's creation. But at the end of the day, all of those things are so minuscule, placed beside the one who actually put them where they are. You have to remember the God that we serve is the one who carved out the seas, raised up the mountains. He's the one who set this globe spinning. He's the one who hung the stars and placed the planets where they go. He's the one who breathed life into humanity, and the one who sent his son Jesus to die for our sin. Same God. Same God. Job, as he's walking through the middle of these trials that he endures, if you're not familiar with the story of Job, it's this incredible tale of just loss and sorrow that really helps us to wrestle with the question, where's God in these hard times? About 2/3 of the way through Job's story, God steps in. And God intervenes after chapters of Job defending God against his friends and defending his own righteousness against his friends. He comes out and God says, hey, Job, you're asking questions. Can I just ask you for a minute? Where were you when all of this happened? Where were you when the oceans were dug out? Where were you when the canyons were split? Where were you when the planets were aligned? Where were you when? And Job just has to say, Lord, you know. I don't have an answer because I wasn't. And so here, as we see God reveal himself in the storm, we're going to see his care, we're going to see his protection, and we're going to see the way that he navigates, not from the storm, but sometimes the only way is through the storm. Verse 27. The Bible tells us when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. And what this is, if you're unfamiliar, is they would have taken a weight of some sort. This would have been a tool they had already on the ship. But there's a weight attached to a long length of rope. And they take the weight and they throw it overboard. And when the rope gets slack, they know that it's hit the bottom. And so they take a measurement. And that's how far they are from the bottom here. So it gives them an idea of where they are at in relation to the land. And so here they take this sound and they get the measurement, and it comes back that they're about 20 fathoms. A fathom is about 6 feet. And so this is about 120 feet from the bottom of the sea. So they, a little further on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And so it's getting shorter, indicating likely that they're coming up on land. Fearing that we might run across the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And so they're anxious about what's coming next. They can't see anything, and so they don't want to be driven into the rocks. And so they say, we're safe here. Let's lay down anchors. And so from the front of the ship, from the stern, from the rear of the ship, from the stern, they drop down these anchors and they secure themselves in place. As the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea, under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. And so we find even this group of soldiers that were pretending to let down other anchors. They said, oh, well, we'll climb down in the boat. It'll be easier from here. And as they're doing so, they're trying to get off of this ship so they can make their way to this land on the smaller boat attached to it. And Paul says, that's not a good idea. God has promised safety to those in the ship. I can't speak to that if they decide to go on their own. And can I just remind you, there's not a shortcut out of God's will and God's plan for your life. If there is, you don't want to take it. When God has set these circumstances in our path, the way out is through. Okay, you hear me? The way out is through. And now these soldiers are attempting to shortcut and circumvent and create their own way towards the land. And so Paul warns them about what ought to take place instead. And then we find in verse number 33, as day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. And so it's been 14 days where the majority of the ship has not eaten here. We don't know specific, but we know that there has not been a meal distributed from the ship for 14 days. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he said these things, he took bread, giving thanks to God in the presence of all. He broke it and began to eat. And can I point out to you just some of the irony that's going on here? What is Paul's duty on the ship? He is a prisoner. And he's the one that's like calling the shots now. There's a man on here who's a centurion, a leader of 100 soldiers. The owner of the ship is on here. The captain of the ship is on here. Like, there's a lot of people who ought to be authority figures on the ship. And all of a sudden, they're like, hey, Paul, what are you thinking? But Paul had demonstrated that he understood the wisdom that God had been revealing to him. And so now Paul is the one saying, hey, guys, this is a good idea. Hey, guys, it's your call, but... Then they all were encouraged in verse 36 and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. And then verse 39, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. And so they set their sights on, and they said, okay, if the wind's favorable, we'll ground it on that beach, and then we'll all make it in, and we'll be safe. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. And these are those oars that we were talking about. So now they're going to try to steer what little they can with these oars coming from the back of the boat. Hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. And so now they're not on the shore. Instead, they're on this reef outside of the bay. And so now this is not the plan. Once again, the bow stuck and remained immovable. And so this is the front of the ship. It's lodged in these reefs. They can't generate enough force with these oars to get it off. Likely at this point, if it's lodged in here, it's probably taking on some water, beginning to leak. But we know for sure the stern was being broken up by the surf. And so these heavy waves from the storm are coming against the back of the ship, beginning to tear it apart. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. Remember that as a Roman prison guard, as one who is responsible for prisoners, their escape is on those soldiers who are taking them with. And so if it's found that these men escape their care, if they are later found elsewhere that they have neglected their duties, these soldiers are now going to be the ones facing the consequences. And so fearing for their own well-being, they plan to kill the prisoners. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. These soldiers were not like the sharpest tools. Let's just all admit it right here. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on the pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. You see, in the middle of this, we found a storm that was great. We find a God who is greater. And we're reminded here at the end of the story that our boats are small. Our boats are small. Often, we like to picture ourselves as being more capable as we actually are. A pretty universal human trait. We plan and we work and we go about, and this ship had reason to believe that they would be able to navigate this. They had an experienced crew. They had some very unintelligent soldiers. They had a sound ship going into it. They had a reasonable plan. None of these things matter because in the face of the storms of life, we find ourselves overwhelmed. And in the face of a storm, they had no alternative action that they could have taken. One Yiddish proverb says that man plans and God laughs. You see, we all have it together until we don't. And the tools that helped us when the sky was blue are suddenly gone when the sky is gray or black. You see, the stars that often guide us, the things that we align our lives to, all of a sudden when they disappear, what do we do now? The sail that drives our lives, when it's no longer usable, what happens now? The oars that steer us in the face of the storm. Even with wealth, these things are worthless. The titles no longer mattered. The goods no longer mattered. The only part of this whole ship that actually did its job were the anchors. And then they had to cut those loose as they needed to go and escape to the shore. See, our boats are small. Our ability is small. Navigating life on our own, good luck. Good luck. Because we make terrible gods. I mean, we make terrible gods. You know the person who has lied to you the most? You are. You're the one that said you're going to start working out this year. All right? It's November. How's it going? We lie to ourselves all the time. We deceive ourselves all the time. We all of a sudden get anxious because we think, well, that person is believing and seeing and doing this thing, and they think this, and then 99% of the time, what happens? That wasn't true, but we fooled ourselves into thinking it was true. Or we say, oh, I'm capable, I'm able, I can do this, and then we don't, or we can't. How often do we see these things happen in our own lives? No one has hurt you more than you've hurt you. Understand this. We make terrible gods. We find ourselves like the men on this ship. In the middle of a storm, we just, what do you want me to do? But you know who's in control in the middle of it? God is. God is. Because God knows both how large the storm is. He knows how incapable our boat and our own doing is. And so God intervenes. And in fact, in our own lives, the thing that has played out throughout human history is that as human beings, we have this enemy that often we call Satan. We call him the devil. We have this problem that's inside of us called our sin. And that sin separates us from God. And the enemy loves to see that sin grow and take over our lives, take over our communities and our cultures. He loves to see that spread because he understands that sin kills everything it touches. Sin destroys from the inside out. But God also understands these things. And so God sent his son, Jesus. Because he knew from the very beginning, from the first time that man went against and disobeyed back in the garden, he understood that you can't save yourself, but Jesus can save you. You can't save yourself, but Jesus can save you. See, our boats are small. Our works pale in comparison to God's goodness. We don't measure up. We aren't capable. We aren't able. I'm not here to give you a hoorah pep talk and talk to you about how great you are. Listen, I care about you, and so does God. He loves you even though you are weak and incapable, which was one of the amazing things about him. The Bible tells us that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. The book of Romans tells us that God he demonstrated his love for us, that even though you were weak and sinful and erring and wrong, he sent Jesus. And the scripture tells us in Romans chapter 6 that the wages, the payment for this sin, the required cost of this sin, it's death, it's separation, it's condemnation. But the free gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. See, you can't overcome on your own. You can't be good enough, strong enough, smart enough. It's just not how it works. That's why we have men and women who have ascended the social ladder. They have everything in front of them that they could ever want. And yet, what do we see so often in the lives of the rich and famous? We find heartbreak and heartache. We find an excessive divorce rate. We find overdosing, and we find extensive drug abuse. Why? Because they've looked around the world and they said, I have everything I could ever hope for, and yet, here we are. I recall this interview with Tom Brady that happened a number of years ago now, while he was still playing in the NFL. And he was married to one of the wealthiest women in the world. He's a multi-time MVP, Super Bowl winning quarterback. He has all the stuff that you could hope for. In fact, I say the name Tom Brady, and 95% of you in here know who that is. This man had everything. And in this interview, he says, I just thought there'd be more. I just thought there would be more. Man. And sometimes we can be tempted to say, hey, I'd like to try the multi-Super Bowl winning thing and the tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollar thing, and then I'll let you know what I think. But he sits there and he goes, I thought there'd be something else. Because we've all seen it. Maybe you can remember a time in your life where you thought, hey, well, if I just had a full-time job and I could make this amount of money. But then you make this amount of money and then you say, well, yeah, but like inflation. So actually I need this amount of money. And we blame it on all the other stuff when we're not satisfied. But could it be that we're not satisfied because we're aligning our hearts to the wrong things? We're putting our hopes in a dinghy in a storm. When in reality, God is calling us to trust not in the boat that is the vehicle of deliverance, but in Him, the one who's going to be doing the delivering. You hear the difference? So understand with me. Here, the storms of life are going to come. They will rock you. They will punch you in the mouth. And you'll look around saying, God, where are you in the middle of this? This happens to all of us. Even the most devoted Christians, we have those moments where we're just a little shell-shocked. It happens. Being a follower of Jesus does not mean perfection, but here's what it does mean. It means that when we orient ourselves, we don't orient ourselves on the ship. We orient ourselves on the one who created everything around us. Because He is the one that is able to get you through this storm. He's the one that is able to accomplish His will and His purposes through that storm. And can I tell you this? I love these words of the scripture. He who has begun a good work in you, that transformation into the image of Jesus Christ, He will be faithful to complete it God doesn't start a job and not finish it. You might, as you think about the bathroom at home that you worked on 9 months ago and you forgot where your hammer was. God doesn't do that. He gets into the work and you're the work. He's building you up and he is sanctifying you and conforming you into the image of Jesus Christ that you may be more like him day by day. And he doesn't stop until it's finished. And so follow with me. Your boat is small. It's going to go out into the storms of life and it's going to get wrecked. Because the storms are big. But your God, so much bigger.